how he's lived in Hawaii, Thailand. He did some educational work in Thailand. So, from my perspective, as someone who grew up in the East End of Glasgow in Scotland, but who's also lived in West Africa, in Italy, in England, and a long time here, that's one of the things I love about being in other places. So I'm sure Frankie's experience is very similar to my own. So anyway, we're not here to listen to me. So please go ahead, Frankie.
Absolutely. Thank you, John. So yeah, that's kind of the context from where I'm speaking today, Teeb. For anyone who doesn't know, I've been actually born and raised in the San Francisco Bay Area. And as diverse as the Bay Area is, the area that I lived at, fairly homogenous from like an ethnic and racial perspective, right? So kind of growing up, I was raised in this bubble of kind of affluence and whiteness and things like that. And when I was 17, decided to kind of cast off that, and I decided to join a fishing boat in Hawaii. So you really can't go to any lower rung society than getting paid less than minimum wage, working about 20 hours a day, alongside folks who have nothing close to a visa or any kind of safety paperwork here. So again, luckily I've got some really intimate knowledge of dealing with Pacific Islanders. I began my educational journey there as well. So I did actually get a minor in Southeast Asian Studies, as well as Pacific Island Studies there. So we're going to talk about some of the background the Pacific Islanders have faced, my experiences in Hawaii, and also kind of transition to the Southeast Asian perspective, in which I've got a lot of experience as well. So as usual, unfortunately, I am going to subject y'all to a PowerPoint here in which I've put together a few slides. And again, we'll just start with the basics again. We are going to quickly go through, again, some of the sacrifices that our Asian American and Pacific Island brothers and sisters have gone through over about the last few hundred years in relation to America, because while I don't necessarily love rehashing the trauma Olympics, I do think it gives us a contextual perspective of how we approach the issue of racial equity kind of moving forward. And again, my experience just comes from, again, the first time I was able to branch out from my small bubble was in kind of the Hawaiian and Southeast Asian areas. So again, let's take a look at some of the harder to stomach issues, but also transition to some of the funner facts and features of each culture respectively here. So this is something that I didn't know, especially kind of going to university in Hawaii. They really do, again, highlight and correct some of the incorrect assumptions, that a lot of even scientific minds in the Western hemispheres have kind of related, right? So part of the first immigration of Pacific Islanders started way back, I believe it was about 3,500 years ago. This was even before the Iron Age, in which they eventually migrated from the Philippines to the Solomon Islands and began the long treks over open ocean between the Solomon Islands to Samoa, from Samoa to Tahiti all the way up to Hawaii. The longest stretch of that version being from Tahiti to Hawaii, which is over 3,000 miles. I've actually made that journey on a fishing boat before. It is incredibly difficult to make on a modern fishing vessel. I was on an 87-foot steel-hulled fishing vessel, and even then, we went through a hurricane, and we heard someone on the radio who ultimately was going down, and we don't know what became of that person. So to know that these folks began that journey in outrigger canoes with no modern, capabilities is absolutely stunning, and I think it really does speak to the ingenuity and the level of understanding of their environment that they possessed that long ago. Again, getting into some of the other difficulties, though, that have arose for those groups of people. I mean, kind of as early back as 1882, we're talking about Asian American Heritage Month. I think we'd be remiss if we didn't review and discuss, the Chinese Exclusion Act. This one is always sort of a stain on American cultural record, because it was the only time that we in America have isolated a singular people and said, oh, these people cannot come in anymore. Ultimately, it was due to the Chinese, and again, probably not due to the Chinese, it was aimed at curbing Chinese immigration because they were providing such cheap labor, particularly for the railroad expansion. But again, it was the first time until, I guess, what we could call, quote unquote, the Muslim ban, that we had aimed a finger back at a specific peoples. Moving a little bit forward in the 1800s, 1898 is when Queen Liliuokalani was ultimately forced to give up Hawaiian sovereignty and turn over the governance of the Hawaiian nations to the United States. Now, statehood didn't happen for about 50 more years, but in the boom of the sugar plantations between the 1800s and kind of early 1900s, America had been using Hawaii because it is sort of the bus stop between Asia and American sea trade routes. Without Hawaii, you really didn't have the ability to do trans-Pacific trade. It's just too vast of an ocean to cross, I guess, without some sort of stopping point, which was why Hawaii was so crucial to the process, and ultimately why America took it. Moving forward a little bit, again, if we're still talking about Asian American contributions, ultimately sacrifices, is the Japanese internment that happened. Again, it's another really kind of painful reminder of how American citizenship unfolded. And at that time, while these were American citizens, they were not afforded the same rights as American citizens. During the beginning of World War II, again, Japanese citizens, for everyone who might not be familiar with this, were interned in concern that some of them may be potentially spies working for the Japanese government. So again, they had their homes taken from them. They were stored in camps around California. I had actually visited one of those as part of our elementary education, which was incredibly somber to see and hear from some of the people who stayed in them. Again, some of the lowlights, if we're talking the trauma Olympics here, is also the American nuclear testing that happened in the South Pacific. That also gives way ultimately to the Compact of Free Association. Us as Americans, in our search for mastering nuclear technology, ultimately poisoned some of these South Pacific areas to the point where they are no longer inhabitable. That is ultimately what led to the Compact of Free Association. And in this, it really just states that anyone from this federated Micronesian state, it's really a group of islands there, has citizen access to the United States and can migrate freely. They get an American passport. And again, that's really because so much nuclear testing had happened there. Their islands are no longer habitable. The coconuts are sour. The fish is yellow. Again, we really decimated that area. So ultimately, we were forced to kind of take on the inhabitants of those people and give back through various welfare programs, which is nice, and it's a start, but it also kind of translates into some of the inequity that we see between these populations today. As of now, Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders are actually the lowest earning ethnicity in the United States. So even below Native Americans, which we've again offered some sovereign lands to and things like that. Hawaiians never got that. Pacific Islanders never got that. So it does contribute to some of the inequity today. But let's highlight out, again, some of the cooler parts of our Pacific Islanders' contributions here, again, and get away from some of the bummers here. And I just cannot stop thinking about when these folks started making their way. As a fisherman, again, I told you I'd been on the open ocean quite a bit, and I can't tell you how terrifying it is when you get to that first mile off of land, then you turn around and you cannot see anything behind you. All you see is a vast open ocean with no markers on the horizons. And these folks, again, would set out over these vast 3,000-mile stretches using nothing but just navigating by the stars at night. That was a big one. Again, the bird observation, as rare as it was to see a bird out there, once they did, they would kind of be able to know. They were able to track swells. So they'd be knowing, okay, well, if we got to the Solomon Islands and you start seeing a trough developing off the starboard side, take a right, 90 degrees kind of thing. Additionally, they use sky, clouds, and also reflections to help guide the way. But again, at the time, it was just really unthought of that anyone could make those journeys. And I don't know that I would ever have the guts to do anything close to that. And just to get a quick visual representation, again, Solomon Islands is where the journeys normally started. They'd make their way to Samoa, again, eventually to Tahiti, the longest expanse being from Tahiti up to Hawaii. Now, this first journey, and Hawaii also is so isolated. It is actually the most isolated place on Earth as far as landmass and ocean surrounding. So when people started, kind of archaeologists started trying to derive theories about how people got there, it was sort of unheard of to think that these people could have methodically charted a course from Solomon Islands to Samoa, etc. So if y'all remember the movie Kon-Tiki, there was a Norwegian explorer named Thor. Oh gosh, I forget Thor's last name at this point. But he had said there's no way that these people, could have migrated using the stars. It's just too vast. What they must have done had used the natural currents that exist from South America and ultimately wound up Hawaii, sort of washed up in Hawaii. There was no widely held belief that there could have been any sort of intelligent and intent migration from where they started to where they ended up. So he created this experiment in which he left from Peru in this vessel that we see right here called the Kon-Tiki. He eventually arrived in in Hawaii, and said, "Yep, I proved it. There we go." And it wasn't until, again, years later, with a lot of great archaeological work there, that they had kind of derived and learned that people did, in fact, migrate incrementally from those islands. Talking about Hawaii today, though, unfortunately, again, the Hawaiians, the Pacific Islanders at large, are the poorest population in the United States. Now, granted, they are a smaller population. They do only make up 0.5% of the total U.S. population. And maybe already kind of highlighting the disparity in income there, they also make up over 249% of their representation in the military itself. So a lot of areas like Hawaii, like American Samoa, like Micronesia, military service is offered as an out of kind of poverty that they've been relegated to here. Again, there has also been calls due to this sustained poverty for Hawaiian and Pacific Islander sovereignty. That was actually a big movement in Hawaii, probably about 10 years ago. You had senators talking about potential, sovereignty reunification and things like that. I don't think anything that would actually ever happen, just given that there's so much intertangled trade between continental states and the Hawaiian nation, so to speak. But it was interesting that it got to that point. Again, if you ask, well, why are the Hawaiians so poor at this point? We just have not invested in education of the Hawaiian peoples, much like in Canada with some of the reform schools that existed there and in the United States. We did put the Hawaiian people through re-education camps in which we stripped them of their cultural identities and installed quote unquote American identities. In that, everything got lost in translation. It's just sort of been a cascading effect throughout the generations until we've got to this point now that Hawaii is at a crucial inflection where homelessness is so rampant there. At 20% of all Pacific Islanders who live on Hawaii are homeless. It's an incredible statistic there. It's unmatched and unparalleled in other areas, but it's, again, just kind of a staggering issue. But that's not to say that Hawaiians don't have a great time or you can't have a great time in Hawaii. Getting towards, again, some of the funner areas, Hawaiian culture is more so, again, about that Ohana area, and Ohana just means family. While I lived there, it was very rare that you don't know your neighbors by their first name. You haven't had a barbecue with them. When I came back to the United States, I remember I didn't know some of my neighbors in my little suburban area. And the Hawaiians thought that was very funny. They're like, how would you not know the person who lives next to you? Right? So it's kind of funny. Hawaii's also being more recognized, again, for its cultural and scientific contributions. The University of Hawaii is sort of the leader in marine exploration, mapping, and then also kind of scientific breakthroughs when it does come to oceanic studies, as well as cultural exports. Like, I know everyone's seen Moana at this point and Lilo and Stitch, so they are starting to get some of their due there from a cultural perspective as well. Funny fact, again, if you are a foreigner living in Hawaii like I was, you have to get used to racial epithets because they are a way of life. They would call you a haole, and you just got to get used to it. I tried to argue it for the longest time. Never any luck there. I visited Molokai one time, an island of 7,000 people. And I remember asking someone at some point, I'd forgotten to pack some underwear. And the person goes, "I need underwear on Molokai." So it's a laid back island, to say the least there. And finally, they do speak what's called pidgin English there, right? That's the Hawaiian dialect of English. They have their own words, which us Westerners wouldn't know. The first one being pau, P-A-U. If you were to say pauhana, that means a beer after work. Again, pau being the prefix there. So I come home and one of my neighbors asked me, he goes, "Hey, you pow work?" And I go, "Gosh, my power, does it work?" I go inside and I flip the light switch, it turns on, and I go back and I go, "Yeah, my power works." And he goes, "No, bro, you pow work. Are you finished with work?" I go, "Oh." So I avoided that neighbor for the rest of the time I was there. But moving from, again, I guess our Pacific Island areas into some of the Thai and Southeast Asian areas, for anyone who doesn't know, again, I was able to do some of my undergraduate work there as well as graduate work in Thailand, and it's a very interesting country and culture to be a part of. Thailand in and of itself is essentially flat from top to bottom. It's considered the rice bowl of Asia. It produces something like 70% of all of the rice consumed in Asia. It's a ridiculous amount for the square footage that's afforded to them. But historically, that is not made for a kingdom that is very defendable. That is not somewhere where you can set turrets up. That is not anything that you can defend very easily. So Thailand was usually a nation conquered by larger nation, and their people were used for slaves, right? So the kingdoms of Cambodia and Burma were the two superpowers there, each fighting for the Thai people and the Thai lands from which to grow rice on and, again, sustain their subsequent populations on those sort of eastern and western borders of the area. Around the late 1700s, or pardon me, 1600s, 1700s, the Thai started to get this sort of liberation movement, and they finally have ultimately earned and conquered the kingdom and established the kingdom of Siam, which would later become Thailand, and get that independence that they had been seeking for so long. Thailand's also a funny place in that they have an odd kind of monarchy and still bicameral structure of parliament, in which they have, again, two parliamentary houses, but they also have a ruling monarch installed who acts as kind of the prime minister. So again, this was the older king Bayamapul. He was the oldest living monarch, I believe, outside of Queen Elizabeth. I think he had ruled for something like 70 years. He has since passed, and there is his son who is now in power. But what's also interesting about this culture is that national pride is very big in Thailand, and what they do have is also a strict set of lèse majesté laws. These are essentially laws that will criminalize you talking bad about the monarchy in any form. So much so I remember my mom at one point pointed at a picture of the king in a taxi cab, and the taxi cab pulled over and promptly called the police and tried to violate us on the accused of the lèse majesté laws. They thought that we were being detrimental to the king. What I loved about being there as well is that they do call Thailand the land of 1,000 smiles. And I think this probably permeates through all of Southeast Asia, but Thailand specifically. And I wonder if it's because of this fact right here that all Thai people are expected to take the monkhood for at least 2 weeks, or else they bring eternal shame on their family. Now, what it means to be a monk in Thailand is that for 2 weeks, you will shave off all of your hair, your eyebrows, any hair on your body there, and you will wear the orange robe that we see here. You're not allowed to use any sort of money or transact, so any food that you eat is food that is given to you, and you cannot verbally ask. You just walk around with a bowl on really hot pavement in bare feet, and if you are given a meal, you get to eat a meal. You can't ask for a meal, nor can you use money. So every person in Thailand knows what it's like to be ostracized, and they also know what it is like to have nothing from a materialistic standpoint. I think that translates into something. I really enjoyed being there for my time. As you can see, I was lucky enough to work at a monastery there with young monks in which I was teaching English, and that was a lot of fun. They all messed with me in most of the ways you could think there. But Thailand is predominantly Buddhist there. There is a large Muslim population towards the south. Again, the closer you get to Indonesia, the most populous Muslim nation on the country, the more you start seeing some of that Muslims. But again, 96, a little bit over 96% are Thai Buddhist. Things were different than I arrived there. Most of rural Thailand, anywhere outside of Bangkok, does not have the infrastructure to accommodate for toilet paper or flushing toilets. So you can imagine you have to get creative out in the country there. And finally, one thing I never got used to, and I never thought was fancy or cool, was the fact that they have an area. Monkeys are sacred there, right? The god Hanuman is very respected in Thailand, but they also have a town called Lopburi, which is overrun by monkeys. They have said, you know what, these monkeys live here near the church, near the monasteries, the Wats, and we're going to leave them there. It's terrifying. Anyone who thinks that this is a fun place to visit, expel that from your mind right here. Look at these three rascals. They look like they're about to drop a mixtape. I would not go near these guys with a 10-foot pole. I did go there once, and I was chased by a few monkeys who wanted my soda. And I remember this one monk telling me, don't run. Like, if you run, they'll chase you. And I ran, and they chased me. So it was fairly scary. But again, just my overall experience in kind of, just like John said, in traveling, in being the outsider, is that until you get out of your comfort zone. And for me, what it took was being the outsider. Again, a lot of times as white people in America, we don't get the chance to experience racism, right? Especially in the Bay Area, right? I'm the majority. I was always the majority. it wasn't until I moved to Hawaii, who was potentially hostile against white people, right? They had their sovereignty removed at gunpoint, so I could see why they would be hostile, but they were still nice to me despite, again, our perceived differences. Same thing happens in Thailand, and I think it does just breed empathy the more that you can take yourselves and put yourself in an uncomfortable situation and where you are the outsider. And the more you do that, the more you learn. And I'm sure Susan and a lot of the other folks on the team could speak to that. But John, Alicia, that's what I've got for Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month. Again, having none in my blood but experienced a lot of their cultures, I hope it was at least relevant, maybe funny, maybe useful to somebody on the team. And thanks for everybody for letting me speak today.
Great
John, I can
stuff.
pass things back to y'all. Great.
Thanks a lot. That was excellent.
Of course, thank you, team.
Amazing, Frankie.
That was wonderful, Frankie. I really learned a lot. And that was a lot of fun to hear about these places.
Oh, thank you so much. And Bonnie, no, you would not want to pet the monkeys. No, they bite, they scratch, they take your stuff. It is not as fun as it sounds. It's apocalyptic.
Thank you so much, Frankie. Does anyone have questions? Sorry, was someone saying something? Go ahead.
Oh, I was saying, I thought being chased by a goose was scary. I can't imagine being chased by a monkey.
Yes, exactly. There are. Don't want a monkey chasing you. No.
Well, Frankie, I'll just really briefly say my grandmother's from New Zealand, so it kind of tugged at my heartstrings hearing about these cultures because it makes me feel nostalgic and homesick for a place I've never been. One of these days I really want to visit because I have family there.
How freaking cool. Yeah, kind of that whole ocean, they call it Oceania, right? It's so interrelated because they all have such similar cultural values, right? The people from New Zealand ultimately made it to Solomon. People from Solomon made it to Tonga, Tonga to Samoa. So there's these threads of culture that kind of run throughout all of Oceania that are so beautiful. So yeah, I hope you do get to go there one day and let us know about it.
My grandma was not Maori, but she was immersed in that culture. And I remember she would play these records that had traditional Maori chants and dances and songs. And she taught us how to do the haka, a ceremonial war dance. And she taught me Pokerikeriana is a Maori song. And it just, I would love to go there someday and really visit where she got to grow up.
Yeah, there's now the first Maori politician with the facial tattoos, right? Which is that cultural representation.
Yeah.
And I saw that done when I was in American Samoa for a while. They do it for a period of 3 days. Beautiful. And it's done with that. They do it with a shark's tooth and a stick. And it looks so incredible.
It was a shark's tooth. Yes,
say that again. They do it with what?
It is a shark's tooth, Alicia. In Samoa, when they're tattooing the elder men, it's a shark's tooth or a kind of a combination of shark's tooth. It looks like a comb, and they'll just put ink on that and tap it into you. And I guess I got something similar though. When I was in Thailand, I got the bamboo tattoo from the monks, and the monks don't actually tell you what they're going to give you. They just talk to your coach and learn a little bit about you as a person and as a fighter, and then based on that, they'll tattoo you with various spells, and ultimately they're all pretty degrading. If I had to show you them, they're pretty embarrassing. Like I got a snake on me because it was supposed to intimidate people because I'm short and unintimidating. They also gave me an alligator because I'm slow. The alligators are slow. He sits around all day. So I was kind of like, are these going to help me, man? Because my self-esteem is first than what I came here.
It builds your character. You can take it.
I guess so, Alicia. I guess so.
All right. Thanks, Frankie.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.